Chris Bedford joins us now as senior politics editor and D.C. correspondent for The Blaze. Chris, great to have you with us, sir.
Good to be here.
And I should point out also, what's the name of your show over on The Blaze?
Blaze News Tonight. We're on every weeknight on X and YouTube and Blaze TV.
Blaze News Tonight. The Blaze has become even better with Chris Bedford being a part of it. So, what do you make of Joe Biden's hostage video last night?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind, and I muttered this to Sarah, we were watching it after recording, was how sick I am of John Meacham. That's the Biden speechwriter, basically. He's the historian, your dad or grandparents, maybe you have some of his books on your bookshelf. And he has gotten so unbelievably annoying and cliche. It's not said enough that John Meacham, with his Trump dementia, the demented syndrome, has just become a bad writer, always prattling on about saving democracy in the darkest days. It's really the only tools he has. Yeah,
he's the Kamala Harris of Aaron Sorkin's. He's like, he's awful. He's just awful.
He sounds like, he reminds me of a lot of the kids I went to college with who would just binge watch Aaron Sorkin's West Wing.
Right.
And would give these just pronouncements. It's like, we're at a higher level than this right now. But the second thing I thought was how much gaunter he looked, Joe Biden, than just 10 days before. His shoulders weren't as high. He just looked weak, and he was muttering. And then the third thing I thought, kind of reviewing the whole thing, was, listen, for the Acela corridor people and the Democrats who just say, well, look, we got a new candidate now because Joe Biden, who was selected by the voters, can't win. So we're not going to go with him anymore. We got a new one. They might be satisfied. But if you're just a normal person who goes to work and expects honesty from your political parties and expects to be a part of this process, then you hear that speech, you might have noticed that there's not a single ounce of explanation for why Joe Biden is not running again.
None.
It was, look at all the great things I've accomplished. Look at what a wonderful president I am. And now I'm going to pass the torch 100 days before the election? That doesn't cut.
The White House is claiming this week, Coringe was claiming yesterday that he's not leaving because of his health. That's not why he's leaving. And that's the reason they say that is because they need to explain why he's staying in office until the inauguration of the next president. And which is interesting to hear them say because that's quite obviously the basis by which Democrats claim they needed to get rid of him. He alluded to the division within his own party. That division was the product of his failing health, at least according to their explanations.
Yeah, and you saw that in the Oval Office today when he showed up for 90 seconds to talk with Netanyahu before they kicked reporters out. And when the Daily Caller's Reagan Reese shouted out, "Are you resigning because of your health?" He looked at her and shook his head. Well, what other reason could it possibly be other than being strong-armed? I mean, it's clear that he was strong-armed. It was clear that he was strong-armed in his home while he was ill and while he was weak by people who were saying he's too ill and weak to run for president. So maybe it's difficult to argue against them when you can barely lift your head.
Right. That's true. But you and I both know that in the end, fundamentally, it wasn't actually his health that led to his resignation, his being forced out. It was his poll standing. It was his numbers. If Joe Biden were polling ahead of Donald Trump and yet just as demented, they would not be taking him out of office right now.
No, we'd not be having any of these conversations. They wouldn't have done any of these things. He was polling very poorly badly going into the debate. But after the debate, the numbers really started to pull apart. And the Democrat poobahs just felt like they couldn't hide anymore. The problem, they're not concerned for Joe Biden's health. They're not concerned for the effects of stress on someone who's already experiencing the impacts of aging. What they're concerned about solely is beating Donald Trump. And you saw them get really depressed for a little while when they were convinced, oh my gosh, it's all over. What are we going to do? And then they finally came around through the stages of grief, to, well, it has to be Kamala Harris. We have the campaign operation already in place. She's the vice president. It makes sense. The money gets to transfer over legally and easily without a huge fight from the Republicans. This is the way to go. And as soon as it happened, just the corporations, the big Democratic donors, just unleashed an historic amount of money. And the Democrats went from so depressed to so energized, and so happy. And Joe Biden just got pushed by the side, too weak to even He didn't even give a speech explaining it for a couple of days, and when he did, he didn't explain anything.
No, he didn't explain a thing. I saw Tucker Carlson had an interview today with Dr. Ben Carson, and very quickly in the interview, they get to this point. Ben Carson, a smart, brilliant guy, he pointed out, he's like, this is a huge test for the media and whether or not it has the ability to convince the public that Kamala Harris is in any way a good candidate. That this is at its core, what this is a test of the media's ability to rig our elections. Will they be able to successfully do it this year? They're moving quickly, Chris Bedford. What do you think the chances are?
I think they're decent. They're working really hard at this. I mean, this is one of the reasons that they were so adamant about not losing control over Twitter. It's because Twitter would have played a major part in this, in which things were trending and which articles were pushed down, and now it's a free space. But they still have things like TikTok. The Chinese government controls it, but they're not interested in Donald Trump being around. So you suddenly have all this stuff coming out about how cool Kamala Harris is. No one believes she's cool. If there was an ounce of cool in Kamala Harris, then this administration, which is obsessed with identity politics, would have put her out front and center. But she has been hidden for 4 years because of how bad and cringy and Hillary-esque a politician she actually is. And then you've got the CNN folks talking about it. And at the same time, you've got the Axios and everyone else coming out and condemning anyone who pointed out that Kamala Harris was in charge of the border. She was never the border czar. But then when it turned out that Axios itself had talked about how she was the border czar, as opposed to going back and saying, you're right, that was unfair, they said their old reporting was wrong. Now, of course, she didn't officially have the title, but she is the highest-ranking official in the U.S. government who was charged with overseeing the border. It makes sense. And they'll try to memory hold that. They'll try to memory hold the whole thing and do it with a straight face, too. It's wild.
Yes. No, that's totally right. And I was pointing out earlier, remember back in 2009, Chris, that Van Jones was called the Green Job Czar when he worked for Barack Obama. And his title was some ludicrously long official title that wasn't Green Job Czar. So in other words, he wasn't the Green Job Czar. Well, yeah, he was. That's literally the entire media referred to him that way, including, and they did the same thing with Kamala Harris. And on this issue of the border, had Kamala been successful, and of course, really, the Biden administration had no intention of fixing the border problem. Their problem was a PR problem. They wanted people to stop paying attention to it. That's what they were really trying to do. But had she, in some alternate universe, solved the border problem, they'd be crowing today that she was the border czar, Chris. That what a great success she was because she was the border czar.
Yeah, they would. They're going to try and change every aspect of her record. They're going to try and ignore and pretend the things that are awful, which is most of it, didn't happen. I mean, I think you saw the online rankings of the most liberal senator that she had won in 2019
yes.
were deleted.
GovTrack.
They're going to try and pretend that. None of this ever happened, and the accomplishments she has are going to completely exaggerate. If you look at her accomplishments, if you dig through the legislation she actually worked on in her years in the Senate, it's just a bunch of DEI and gender garbage and messaging bills. It's nothing that she could really actually brag about. Nothing that's really made an impact. Nothing really bipartisan. That's who she's always been. That's who she was for. Oh, and by the way, remember when Joe Biden said, I'm going to pick a vice president who was a black female? That was the criteria.
Yes.
And then they finally settled on Kamala Harris. It's like he said this in interviews. He said it in speeches. Well, now to point that out is racist. So Republicans who pointed that out, they're just the worst people in the world. And these are the sorts of things that Republicans are going to have to face as they work hard to define Kamala Harris, and the media works hard on the other end to define her as some kind of cool, great, and important and seismic shifting politician.
Yeah, no, they're going full North Korean right now, and you just have to be able to identify that and confront it. Chris Bedford, thank you as always over at the Blaze, sir. Good to talk to you today.